This black sergeant was framed for treason, but a soiled dove held the proof to save him. The Badlands stretched like a scar across the west, jagged, blistered, and godless. Heat shimmered off the rocks, painting illusions of water where none had flowed in months. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, watchful, like the land itself was holding its breath. Sergeant Thomas Grit Harding knelt beside a horse track half buried in dust, fingers grazing the rim of a fresh boot print. His jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the horizon, not for bandits but for the next betrayal. Behind him, the remnants of the 10th Cavalry waited in uneasy silence. Black men in blue coats, sunburned and blamed for crimes they didn't commit. Each one carried a rifle, and a truth no white courtroom would hear. Thomas didn't speak. Not about the gold gone missing. Not about the captain who vanished just before the ambush. And never about what the brass whispered behind closed tents. He'd seen this setup before, orders that reeked of politics, of pawns placed to fail. A hot gust lifted his sergeant's hat just enough to reveal a scar below his left ear, earned in a war that promised freedom and paid in silence. He rose. A buzzard circled overhead. Someone was closing in. And it wasn't justice. The year 1885 clung to the Badlands like a shroud of rust-colored dust, a cruel embrace that offered no solace. Only the relentless rasping breath of wind across eroded rock. Here, near the desolate expanse where the ground itself seemed to writhe with ancient grievances, stood the encampment of the 10th Cavalry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers. Even the air, thin and sharp with the scent of dry sage and distant alkali, felt weighted with a silent, simmering hostility. A hostility born not just of the land's own unforgiving nature, but of the very souls who grudgingly shared its harsh embrace. Outside the crude stockade, the elements were merciless. Within, a different kind of cruelty reigned, subtle as a whisper, sharp as a switchblade. Sergeant Thomas Grit Harding moved among his men with the quiet, effortless authority of a man forged in fire. His uniform, though perpetually dusted, was impeccably kept, his posture ramrod straight, a living testament to the discipline that defined him. He was a Buffalo soldier, a black man in a blue uniform, and within the tightly knit ranks of his regiment he commanded respect, earned through years of unwavering loyalty, unerring aim, and a courage that never faltered even when facing the spitting barrels of Cheyenne warriors or the cold, indifferent gaze of the unforgiving plains. He was disciplined and proud. Yet beyond the rough-hewn timbers of the camp fence, the world shifted. Here, respect curdled into contempt, and his uniform, a symbol of duty, became a target for the bitter disdain of those he was sworn to protect. He yearned for respect, a simple human acknowledgement that rarely came from beyond the thin line of his fellow soldiers. The very air outside the camp seemed to vibrate with unspoken slights, with the weight of generations of prejudice that settled on his shoulders like the dust of the Badlands itself. His face, often stoic, would occasionally betray the weary expression of a man who had seen too much injustice, too many battles fought where the true enemy was not always visible. He faced racism from those he protected. The order arrived with the dawn, delivered by a messenger whose horse seemed to carry the urgency of the distant world beyond. It was a detail shrouded in the usual military curtness, yet Thomas felt an immediate, unsettling current beneath the official jargon. Their unit, a proud detachment of the 10th Cavalry, was tasked with escorting a government gold shipment, a gleaming, vulnerable serpent of wealth, across this very wilderness destined for a distant military outpost. This path, etched deep into the Badlands, snaked through territories still haunted by the ghosts of secession, where the remnants of former Confederate forces often roamed, their bitterness a poison that lingered long after the war's end. Thomas knew these lands had felt the chill of their history, understood that the very soil beneath their boots still remembered the taste of blood and betrayal. These were men haunted by the war, searching for a place to belong, still carrying their old rifles. These were the ghosts they would pass through, the very air breathing whispers of old battles and forgotten grievances. As they prepared to depart, the tension in the air was palpable, almost a living thing. The usual camaraderie of the camp was subtly fractured by a new element. The presence of the white officers, their gazes sharp, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves in a pre-storm wind. Their eyes, though technically allied, held a flicker of suspicion, a silent judgment that seemed to fall heavier on the dark faces of Thomas's men. It was the same look he had encountered 1,000 times in dusty towns and crowded saloons, a look that stripped away his uniform, his rank, his very humanity, leaving only the color of his skin. Each hushed comment, each sidelong glance from these white officers settled upon them like the red dust of the Badlands, fine, pervasive, and suffocating. It was a constant, irritating grit that worked its way beneath the skin, undermining the proud discipline of the buffalo soldier. Thomas maintained his outward composure, his face a mask of disciplined resolve. He barked orders, checked equipment, ensured every man was ready. His movements sharp and efficient. He moved with a quiet resolve, a silent strength that belied the turmoil within. He oversaw the loading of supplies, the final checks of their horses, the precise arrangement of their escort formation. Every glint of brass, every creak of leather, every measured step was a testament to the rigid order he had embraced, a stark contrast to the chaos of the world beyond the military's embrace. But within the quiet confines of his own mind, a seed of doubt, insidious and unwelcome, began to sprout. He had served his country with honor, had faced down countless dangers, had watched good men fall. Yet in the eyes of these white officers, there was a question, an unasked accusation that cut deeper than any enemy bullet. Was their service, their unwavering loyalty, merely a convenient facade for some darker, unspoken calculation? Was their black skin simply a shield, a disposable asset in a game they were never truly meant to win? The sun, now rising higher, cast long distorted shadows across the camp, and Thomas wondered if those shadows merely reflected the twisted truth of their mission. The distant call of a bugle, usually a sound of pride and purpose, now carried an unsettling echo, a haunting query that hung in the vast, indifferent air of the Badlands. This journey was not just about gold. It was about the weight of their very existence in a world unwilling to grant them true respect. The sun, a relentless forge in the vast canvas of the sky, beat down upon the column as it snaked its way deeper into the desolate heart of the Badlands. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light, the ever-present dust, and the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels under the weight of the government gold. Sergeant Thomas Harding moved at the head of his men, his senses sharpened by the arid silence, every nerve alert to the deceptive stillness of the land. They were approaching Devil's Backbone, a stretch of fractured bone-dry earth where the ravines ran deep like old wounds, and shadows lay thick even at midday. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones, a natural fortress for those who wished to remain unseen. "Keep your eyes peeled. Private," Thomas murmured to a young soldier riding beside him, his voice low, barely audible above the hoofbeats. "This ain't no place for sightseeing." The private, fresh-faced and eager, nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Yes, Sergeant. Just seems quiet. Too quiet." "That's how it always starts," Thomas replied, his gaze sweeping the jagged ridges above them. He knew this quiet. It was the breath held before the storm, the deceptive calm before the strike. He felt the familiar unease prickling at his neck, a cold intuition honed by years of survival. Then, without warning, the Badlands erupted. A cacophony of gunfire tore through the silence, a sudden brutal symphony of lead and screams. Men shouted, horses whinnied in terror, and the air filled instantly with the acrid scent of gunpowder. The ambush was swift, merciless. Riders, appearing as if born from the very rock, swarmed down from the bluffs, their faces contorted with a chilling fury. Leading them was a gaunt, hawk-nosed man, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred, Boone, an ex-Confederate officer, his spirit still festering with the bitter defeat of war, especially the sight of black men with guns in their hands. He was a ghost of a war that refused to die, carrying his hatred like a banner. Thomas threw himself from his horse, rolling into the cover of a shallow gully, his rifle already raised. "Form up, return fire, protect the wagon!" He roared, his voice cutting through the chaos, a pillar of command amidst the crumbling order. His men, the Buffalo Soldiers, reacted with the discipline ingrained by countless drills and real battles. They fought with a desperate ferocity, their blue uniforms stained with dust and sweat, their faces grim. The battle raged, a brutal close-quarters melee. Bullets whizzed past, digging into the rock, tearing through flesh. Thomas saw his comrades fall, brave men, loyal men, cut down by a hatred that transcended mere robbery. The white officers who had ridden with such an air of superiority seemed to vanish in the initial surge, their commands drowned out, their presence lost in the smoke and violence. The gold wagon, the very heart of their mission, became the focal point of the maelstrom, its heavy timbers groaning under the assault. When the dust finally began to settle, leaving a haze of smoke and the coppery tang of blood in the air, the scene was one of devastation. Many soldiers lay still, their lives spilled onto the unforgiving earth. The white officers, including the expedition leader, were gone, their horses either ridden off or scattered in the fray. And the gold, the entire shipment, had vanished without a trace, spirited away into the labyrinthine ravines of Devil's Backbone. Only a handful remained, mostly Buffalo Soldiers, their faces grim, their uniforms torn, their bodies aching with wounds. As they gathered, a detachment of cavalry, entirely white, rode in their faces hard and unyielding. They hadn't come to offer aid. A grizzled captain, his eyes cold as flint, dismounted, surveying the grim scene. He didn't spare a glance for the dead. His gaze landed directly on Thomas and his men, a look of contempt hardening his features. "Sergeant Harding," he spat, his voice dripping with accusation. "Where's the gold? Where are the officers?" Thomas stood tall, despite the ache in his ribs, his voice steady. "Captain, we were ambushed. Boone's gang. The officers, they were overwhelmed. The gold was taken." The captain scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Overwhelmed, or conveniently gone missing. Funny how only you lot survived this ambush with nary a scratch on that gold. And where's the lead officer, Major Albright?" "We fought Sir another Buffalo Soldier, Corporal Jenkins, interjected, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "We fought hard, Boone's men, they were like devils out of the rock." The captain's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what you saw, Corporal. All I see is a missing gold shipment and a convenient lack of white witnesses. Sounds like a classic case of opportunism to me. A bunch of freed men getting ideas above their station." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a poisoned dart. "We are soldiers, sir," Thomas retorted, his voice rising, a tremor of fury beneath his rigid discipline. "We uphold our oath. Your oath means little when there's gold involved, Harding," the captain sneered. He turned to his own men. "Round 'em up. They're under arrest for desertion and theft of government property. Orders for their capture will be issued immediately. No chances. The Army's reputation depends on this." A cold dread settled in Thomas's gut. They weren't just accused, they were condemned. A bounty would be placed on their heads, making them targets not just for Boone's vengeful gang, but for every ambitious lawman and bounty hunter looking for a quick payday. They were to be made examples, their service, their loyalty, their very lives sacrificed to save face for the military. The sun, once a symbol of justice, now seemed to mock them, casting long accusing shadows across their broken formation. The Badlands offered no mercy, only the promise of slow, agonizing death for those caught in its unforgiving embrace. Thomas and his remaining men, now fugitives, moved like phantoms through the desolate landscape. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a potential threat. They were hunted not just by Boone's gang, but by the very law they had sworn to uphold. The captain's words still echoed in Thomas's mind, a venomous poison, a bunch of freed men getting ideas above their station. He had to find shelter, and quickly. They found it in a forgotten, half-ruined shack miles off any known trail. It was little more than splintered wood and a sagging roof, but it offered concealment. As they huddled within the dust, their only comfort, the true weight of their predicament, settled upon them. "Sergeant," Private Jenkins whispered, his voice hoarse, "what do we do? No one's going to believe us. They just see our skin." Thomas looked at the young soldier, his heart heavy. "We find the truth, Jenkins. That's what we do. The truth is all we got left." He knew the odds were stacked against them. Their lives were on the line, and their honor, which meant more than life itself. Their salvation, unexpected and unusual, came in the form of a woman named Lena. They found her by a trickling spring, surprisingly deep within the Badlands, washing clothes with a practiced, weary rhythm. She was a former soiled dove from a nearby mining town, her past etched in the lines around her eyes. But her gaze was sharp, intelligent, and held a keen understanding of the world's cruelties. Thomas approached cautiously, his hand near his holstered revolver. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "we mean no harm. We're soldiers lost our way." Lena looked up, her hands still in the water. Her eyes, surprisingly warm despite her circumstances, swept over their torn uniforms, the desperate lines on their faces. "Soldiers, huh?" She drawled, a hint of dry wit in her voice. "Last time I checked, soldiers don't usually run through the Badlands like scared jackrabbits, and especially not your kind of soldiers." Her words, though direct, held no malice, only a world-weariness. Thomas straightened, his pride pricked. "We're innocent, ma'am. We were ambushed, framed." Lena slowly wrung out a piece of cloth. "Innocent ain't a word the law uses much out here, especially not for folks like us. But Boone's gang, they're bad news. Heard about the gold train." She looked at Thomas, a calculating glint in her eyes. "And I heard some other things, too. Whispers about who really walks with Boone." She didn't offer help readily, but something in Thomas's quiet dignity and the desperate hope shining in his men's eyes seemed to stir her. "All right," she said, finally rising. "Come on. I got a shack further in. You can hide for a spell, but you owe me, Sergeant. You owe me big." At her hidden shack, Lena provided them with food and a temporary refuge. She was a survivor, resourceful, and surprisingly educated for a woman of her profession. As Thomas recovered, he began to work on his plan. He had to prove their innocence. He started asking Lena about Boone, about the rumors about anyone who might have seen something unusual near Devil's Backbone before the ambush. "You think I got eyes everywhere, Sergeant?" Lena scoffed, though she answered his questions, her sharp wit cutting through his rigid formality. "I got ears, though. And folks talk when they think nobody's listening. Especially about Boone. He's been recruiting from the old Confederate ranksmen with grudges deeper than the Badlands ravines." "Did you hear anything about the white officers?" Thomas pressed his voice tight. "Major Albright." Lena hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. "Heard some whispers. Nothing solid. Just that he always had a taste for gold. And wasn't too particular about how he got it. A man like that, he could be anyone's puppet or anyone's master." She looked at Thomas, her expression softening slightly. "You really think he'd betray his own men, especially his colored soldiers?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "I've seen enough to know what men will do for power, ma'am, and what they'll do to keep a certain kind of order, especially when it means burying the truth under a pile of lies." He felt the bitterness rising, the unfairness of it all. He yearned for respect, but the system itself seemed set against him. Lena nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "You ain't the first good man I've seen get chewed up by this West Sergeant. But you gotta remember, justice out here ain't always wearing a badge. Sometimes it's just a whisper in the wind waiting for someone brave enough to listen." She was a beacon of truth in the chaotic landscape, a subtle subversion of the common perception of a soiled dove. Her dry wit and secret education were proving invaluable. Thomas looked at her truly, looked at her, and for the first time a sliver of something akin to trust began to bloom amidst the bitter dust of his betrayal. He had found an unlikely ally in the very fringes of society, a woman who understood the language of survival and the harsh realities of the frontier better than any officer in his regiment. His search for justice would begin with her whispers. The days in Lena's hidden shack became a crucible for Thomas and his men. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of their precarious situation pressing down. But it was in the quiet hours when the Badlands wind whispered secrets through the splintered walls that the true foundations of an unlikely alliance began to form between Thomas and Lena. Thomas spent his time meticulously planning his focus sharp as a freshly honed blade. He knew Boone's tactics, remembered the brutal precision of his ambush. "He always favors the high ground," Thomas muttered one evening, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. And he'd be hitting the supply lines, maybe the stagecoaches. Lena, perched on an overturned crate, watched him. Her eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of curiosity. "You know a lot about him, Sergeant. Too much for just a regular soldier." Thomas paused, his hand still. "I learned to know my enemy, ma'am. That's how we survived." He looked at her, a silent challenge in his gaze. "You said you heard whispers." "What kind of whispers?" Lena sighed, a long, weary sound. "Folks in the saloons, they talk, especially after a few rounds of rotgut. Boone's been seen with a man. A slicker from back east, folks say. Always dressed fine, smells of city cologne, never gets his boots dirty. Not the kind to be riding with Boone's rough crowd unless he's calling the shots." "A slicker," Thomas pressed. "Anyone get a name? They just call him the broker." Lena mused, her brow furrowed. "Always paying cash, always asking about land, about shipments. Said he had big plans for this territory. Funny, ain't it, a man who calls himself a broker mixed up with a bad egg like Boone?" A cold certainty began to settle in Thomas's gut. This was more than just a simple robbery. "He's connected to Major Albright." He stated a revelation rather than a question. Albright was the broker's man. Lena's eyes widened slightly. "You got proof, Sergeant, or just a gut feeling?" "I got nothing but a name and a lot of dead men." Thomas admitted, his voice rough. "But Albright, he had a reputation. Heard tell he had an ace in the hole back east, too. Family with money, always trying to climb the ladder no matter who he stepped on." As they spoke, Thomas found himself slowly revealing fragments of his own past. He spoke of his family, of the pride his father took in his service, of the hope that joining the Buffalo Soldiers would bring honor and respect, not just for him, but for his people. "We wanted to show them," he said, his voice quiet, "that we were just as capable, just as loyal, just as American." The words hung in the air, weighted with the bitterness of betrayal. Lena listened, her usual dry wit replaced by a rare solemnity. "I know about showing folks what you're made of," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "This West, it strips you bare, shows you what you are and what everyone else thinks you are." She looked away, her gaze distant. "My own life. It wasn't what I planned. Folks call me soiled dove, throw stones. But I survived, and I learned to read people. That's my trade now." Thomas nodded. "You read Boone, then? What does he want?" "Boone." Lena chuckled, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Boone wants to make the West bleed. He wants to make black men like you pay for every single thing he lost in the war. The gold is just a means to an end. He's cussed as a bronc in a branding pen when it comes to you." The conversation shifted, easing into a rhythm of shared purpose. Lena, with her network of whispers and keen observations, became Thomas's eyes and ears in the outside world, gathering snippets of information tracking movements. Thomas, in turn, found himself confiding in her, the rigid walls he had built around his heart slowly crumbling. He spoke of the injustice, the burning need to clear his men's names. She spoke of her own quiet dreams of a life where she wasn't judged for her past, of a place where a woman could be respected for her mind, not just her looks. Their bond deepened an unspoken understanding of shared burdens and the relentless pursuit of an elusive justice. One evening, as the last light faded, Lena brought Thomas a worn, leather-bound book. "Found this tucked away in a saddlebag one of Boone's men left behind," she said, her voice low. "Might be a lead." Thomas took the book. It was a ledger filled with cryptic entries, names, dates, and what looked like supply lists. As he scanned the pages, his jaw tightened. Names, he recognized men connected to Albright dates that matched the gold shipment. And then a name that made his blood run cold, scrawled clumsily at the bottom of a page of coordinates: Boone's hideout, Devil's Kettle. It was more than a hideout. It was a trap. A plan was taking shape, and it confirmed his darkest fears. The confrontation was coming. The wind, which had been a constant mournful companion, now turned into a snarling beast whipping dust and loose tumbleweeds across the Badlands. Sergeant Thomas Harding and his small grim band of buffalo soldiers, along with Lena, moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness. The ledger had been their map, its cryptic entries leading them to a forgotten jagged mesa known locally as the Serpent's Coil, Boone's infamous hideout. It was a place where shadows clung and the very air seemed to hum with past brutalities. "They'll be expecting us, Sergeant," Jenkins whispered, his rifle held ready. "Boone ain't one to leave a trail without a trap." "He expects us to run," Thomas countered, his voice a low growl. "He expects us to break. We won't." His gaze swept over his men, their faces etched with weariness, but hardened by resolve. He then looked at Lena, who moved with a quiet, almost unsettling grace beside them. She carried a small antique pistol, a relic from her past life, but her true weapon was her sharp mind and an uncanny sense for reading men. "This ain't your fight, Lena." Thomas said, his voice softer, a rare moment of vulnerability. "You got a way out. Take it." Lena met his gaze, her eyes dark and resolute, mirroring the dawn that was just beginning to paint the eastern sky. "My fight started the day I learned some men see a woman or a black man as nothing more than property. We go together, Sergeant. Or we don't go at all." Her refusal was firm, unyielding. She understood choosing courage despite fear, a quality Thomas recognized and respected. As the first rays of sun kissed the jagged peaks, they saw at Boone's camp nestled deep within a natural amphitheater of rock. Wagons were scattered, horses tethered, and men moved about, their figures silhouetted against the cooking fires. And there, shining with an almost malevolent gleam, was the stacked gold glinting brazenly in the open. "Too easy," Thomas muttered, his jaw tight. It was a trap. He felt it in his bones. Suddenly a voice rang out, clear and sickeningly familiar, from the opposite ridge. "Well, well, Sergeant Harding. Took you long enough to catch up to your lost gold." It was Major Albright. He stood there impeccable even in the dusty Badlands, flanked by a handful of cavalrymen. His face was a mask of cold triumph, devoid of any shame. "I knew you wouldn't let a fortune just walk away, Harding, especially when it could clear your name. Such a predictable thing, honor." He looked down at Boone's camp, then back at Thomas. "We've been waiting." Boone emerged from the camp, a cruel grin splitting his face. He held a Winchester, but his eyes were on Albright. "Took your sweet time, Major. Got the bait set, got the rats in the trap." "Now what?" Albright merely smiled, a predatory, humorless baring of teeth. "Now, Boone, we clean up. You get the blame for the gold, the massacre. Harding and his savages get the blame for robbing the government. And I, I got the gold, and a clear path. A chilling realization washed over Thomas. It was not just a frame-up, it was a triple cross. Albright had conspired with Boone to stage the ambush, then planted double-cross Boone, using Thomas and his men as the scapegoats for both the robbery and Boone's inevitable demise. It was a brutal display of ambition corrupted by greed, a twisted plot woven by a corrupt authority. "You lying snake!" Boone roared, raising his rifle towards Albright. But Albright was faster. A single shot cracked from his pistol, striking Boone square in the chest. Boone staggered, clutching his wound, a look of shocked betrayal on his face. "You! Judas!" He gasped before collapsing into the dust, his blood quickly darkening the earth. The death of their leader sent a wave of confusion through Boone's men, but Albright's cavalrymen, loyal only to his gold, opened fire on the remaining outlaws. Chaos erupted, a free-for-all of desperate men fighting for their lives. "This is it," Thomas roared to his men, his voice filled with a cold fury. "We fight for our honor, for our lives." He led the charge, a force of raw, righteous anger. The Buffalo soldiers, fueled by betrayal, met Albright's men head-on, a desperate clash of blue and gray against the backdrop of the bloody dawn. Lena, despite the danger, moved like a ghost darting between rocks and sparse brush. She knew this was the moment, not just for Thomas, but for the truth. She saw Albright barking orders, his eyes fixed on the scattered gold. He was vulnerable. "Thomas," she screamed, her voice cutting through the gunfire. "Albright, the ledger, he's trying to hide it." Thomas heard her, his gaze snapping to Albright. He saw the major momentarily distracted, making a subtle movement towards a satchel by his horse. The ledger, the proof. Thomas knew what he had to do. His pursuit of justice had led him here, to the heart of the betrayal. The air in the Badlands amphitheater crackled, not just with the scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fresh blood, but with the raw, volatile energy of betrayal. Major Albright, his face a mask of predatory cunning, raised his pistol, aiming at Thomas. "A pity, Sergeant," he sneered, his voice cutting through the fading echoes of gunfire. "You could have been useful, but you knew too much, and some truths are best buried in the dust." His finger tightened on the trigger. But Thomas was no stranger to death's cold embrace. He moved with the fluid grace of a seasoned warrior, a blur of motion honed by countless skirmishes. He dodged Albright's shot, the bullet whistling past his ear, and closed the distance. This was it, the true enemy revealed. This was not just about clearing their names, it was about exposing the rot at the heart of the system they had blindly served. Meanwhile, Lena, a whirlwind of calculated defiance, saw her opening. While Albright's attention was fixed on Thomas, she darted towards Albright's horse, her small antique pistol clutched tight. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned for the satchel she'd seen. The ledger, the proof, the very thing that could shatter Albright's carefully constructed web of lies. She moved with purpose, fueled by a quiet rage that had simmered for years, a testament to her past as a former soiled dove who had seen too many injustices. Albright and Thomas clashed, a desperate, brutal dance amidst the fallen men and scattered gold. Thomas fought with the measured strength of a man defending not just his life but his honor and the honor of his men. Albright, for all his polished veneer, fought with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal, his greed blinding him to all else. As they grappled, a desperate cry pierced the air. "Sergeant, the satchel." It was Jenkins, wounded but alive, pointing weakly towards Albright's horse. Albright, distracted by Jenkins's cry, momentarily lost his footing. Thomas seized the opportunity, disarming him with a swift, brutal strike. The major's pistol flew across the rocks, landing with a clatter. Albright staggered back, his face contorted in a sneer of pure hatred. "You'll never prove a thing, Harding," he snarled. "My word against yours, and the army will always side with its own kind. No, Lena's voice rang out clear and steady as she returned from Albright's horse clutching a leather satchel. She held up the ledger, its worn cover stark against the harsh light. "Not anymore, Major. This talks." She threw the ledger at Thomas's feet. It lay open, revealing pages of coded entries, names, dates, and transactions that intricately linked Albright to Boone, to the gold, and to the systematic framing of the Buffalo Soldiers. It was proof of his treachery, a damning testament to ambition corrupted by greed. Albright's eyes widened in raw panic. He lunged for a discarded rifle. But Thomas was faster. He had seen enough betrayal, witnessed enough good men fall. This was the moment. This was the reckoning. Thomas's rifle cracked. Albright stumbled, clutching his chest, a look of profound shock and disbelief etched on his face as he fell, his blood seeping into the dust of the Badlands, a silent testament to his fall. The remaining cavalrymen, seeing their commander dead and the ledger exposed, hesitated. Their loyalty to Albright was to the gold, and with the gold now a messy, compromised affair, their resolve crumbled. Some dropped their weapons. Others, sensing the shift, turned their horses and rode off, vanishing into the maze of the Badlands. Silence, profound and heavy, settled over the Serpent's Coil. The battle was over. The gold remained a tarnished testament to greed. Thomas stood over Albright's body, his chest heaving, the bitter taste of victory mingling with the immense weariness of a long, brutal fight. His men, wounded but alive, gathered around him, their faces a mixture of relief and somber realization. Justice, rough and imperfect, had been served in this desolate corner of the West, but the road ahead remained unwritten. Thomas had cleared their names, and this skirmish held the line against treachery. Yet the wider world, the very system that had condemned them, still existed. Would the army truly accept the truth, even with the ledger? Would the lingering shadow of prejudice ever truly lift? Thomas looked out at the vast, indifferent Badlands, then at Lena, her face streaked with dust and grim determination. They had found an improbable ally in each other, a shared understanding forged in blood and betrayal. What now? Would he continue to fight for an army that might never fully accept him? Or would he forge a new path with new allies in a West that was slowly, painfully redefining itself? The wind howled once more, carrying whispers of change, of an uncertain future. The gold lay scattered, glinting under the rising sun, a temptation and a curse. Thomas, his gaze fixed on the horizon, knew only one thing for certain: their journey for true justice, for genuine respect, had just truly begun. The pages of their story beyond this day remained gloriously, terrifyingly blank. If this story of honor, tested and voices nearly erased, stirred something in you, if you felt the echo of that brass bugle in your chest and saw a flicker of dignity where the world tried to cast only shadow, then you've ridden beside the right company. Because out here, justice doesn't always wear a badge, and truth doesn't always make it into the official report. What struck you deepest, when Thomas stood tall with evidence no one wanted, or when Lena's quiet courage made the silence tremble? Smash that, like if their fight rang true, and drop a comment with the moment that stayed in your bones. Next time on Wild West Echo Stories, we follow a girl no older than 10, a sheriff's daughter wearing her father's badge and chasing his killers across dry country. But the only one who will ride with her is the man the town swore to hang. When the law is dead and only a child remembers what justice sounds like, what kind of man steps in to make sure her voice is heard? Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss this unforgettable tale of truth, vengeance, and the girl who became the law when no one else would.